you remember Captain Marvel? That one superhero movie that got global mainstream media coverage and even its own boycott? Yeah, everyone went to see that movie. It made over $1 billion at the box office. Hell, even the less successful Justice League made $650 million in revenue. That's a lot. People just watch comic book movies. While all the Avengers make absolute bank at the box office, their own comic books aren't doing so well. The industry is struggling, comic books aren't selling, and we'll probably never get back to the 90s. We are in a digital age. We still read, but not as much, and it's definitely not traditional comics. Honestly, it makes zero sense to drive across town for a 30-minute read when there's so much good shit online. In other words, these days comic books have been reduced to Netflix series, action games, and Hollywood movies. And maybe a few really cool digital experiments. But as a whole, the once titanic comic book format has not survived the digital era in pristine condition. Why is it that even industry titans like Marvel and DC, despite their best attempts, haven't really made digital comics happen? Why are comic book readers so hesitant to go digital in the first place? Is it about tradition? The loss of physicality? You probably have your own very good reasons to prefer paper comics. But we can't just ignore digital devices. Most of us have a whole bunch of them in our pockets right now. These should be a huge opportunity for the art of comic books to thrive. But it doesn't. It ends up on Netflix, on consoles, in movie theaters, and it's slowly becoming a lost art. So hear me out now. The comic book industry has up. Digital comics were never going to replace physical comics. There is no way to replicate the touch, the smell of paper, or even fit an entire beautiful splash page onto a tiny phone screen. It just can't be done. There's been some great independent attempts. Andre Bergs created Protanopia. It's a 3D motion comic designed especially for tablets. And by the way, if you haven't tried it, absolutely check it out. It's brilliant. Then there is Madefire. They created a tool for enriching traditional comics with sound and motion. And all of these are major steps towards the comic book 2.0. But we're not quite there yet. So this is the part where I casually bring up Liberated and our Playable graphic novel framework. How it swoops in like Captain Marvel to save the day, or so we hope. With Liberated, our mission has always been to identify the weaknesses in digital comics and for every downside present a kick-ass alternative, one that was designed specifically to shine in the digital space. So here's what we do know about digital comics as a whole. They can't fill the physical void completely. It's really difficult to scratch that collector's itch without having something physical present. And they also don't really take full advantage of all the ridiculous technical possibilities that we have right now. Because of that, they don't truly evolve the art of comic books. To create the comic book 2.0, you have to take advantage of everything that digital has to offer. Don't just go and scan a paper comic and call it a day. Do more. Look at video games. There are a lot of video games out there that are inspired by comic books or they look like comic books, but they aren't comic books. At least not yet. Max Payne is a great example. It's a noir cop story that's filled with beautiful hand-drawn comic book cutscenes. And by injecting that very specific comic book art style, it absolutely hammers home its trippy and ridiculous and noir aesthetic. And it does that way more effectively than it could through plain 3D cutscenes. So it's a game that draws from comic book aesthetics and executes its brand of noir perfectly thanks to them. But you definitely couldn't call Max Payne a comic. 13 took on a more involved approach. It is, of course, based on an actual comic, and everything about the game screams comic book. Cel-shaded art, comic book framing, text sound effects all throughout. And yet, at its core, it's still a pretty traditional first-person shooter. A hugely influential one, but in terms of meaningful interactions and story structure, it is a first-person shooter nonetheless. And the brilliant and unforgettable comic book aesthetic, that's the delicious icing.
Mr. Roland?
Then, there's Comic Zone on a Sega Genesis. This one is interesting and absolutely legendary. It's possibly the first comic book game ever made. And it was so memorable because it plays with and completely subverts the idea of a comic. You literally run around on interactive comic book panels. You break that fourth wall. The hero is completely aware that he's inside a comic. It's absolutely delightful. But it was never really about recreating or deepening the comic book experience. It's more of a joyful nod to the medium. And then, of course, we have games based on comics, like Spider-Man, or the Arkham series, or The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. By all accounts, these are totally amazing and fun video games. And they do feature all our favorite comic book characters and stories, just like Hollywood. But that's pretty much as far as it goes. They're not comic book games, they're more like video games based on comic book stories.
Lights out, rich boy.
What we're talking about is bringing the comic book experience over to a whole new medium. The playable graphic novel, the essence of a comic book in an interactive digital space. And that sounds great. What does it actually mean? It means recreating that feeling of reading a comic book. In Liberated, the first thing you see is a comic book, right off the bat. This also places you physically in front of the comic. It says, you are you. You're looking in from your own perspective, the reader's perspective. You flip open that first page and you see all the art and how the scene is composed, and you linger. This wide view is a crucial moment in how you take in a comic book. Only then do you focus on the first panel and then the next, and once you're done with the page, you take a quick glance back and then move on to the next one. You experience the story at your own pace. You flip across actual pages, and for what it's worth, you actually get a digital shelf for your digital comic book collection. But all of that, it's about recreating how you experience a paper comic. The PGN is about more than that. It's about letting the medium grow beyond the restrictions of print. So, to write a playable comic book, you first have to think like a comic book. Write it from the ground up to hit the right balance between story and interaction. If you veer off too far into any one direction, you'll just end up with a visual novel or a game with really cool cutscenes. And at a glance, it all seems pretty simple. Comic book, meet game. But it actually takes a pretty complex simulation to combine everything in a totally seamless way. Down to the sheen of the pages, the little whoosh sound that they make when you flip them. And of course, you can't have a loading screen in a comic book. That would be ridiculous. So in Liberated, the story flows seamlessly from panel to panel. Some of them are about traditional storytelling, while in others, you control the action. That, together with delicate motion, music, sound effects, and even voiceovers, it all comes together. And at that point, you're not reading a comic book anymore. You're participating in the comic. We're here because we believe that this is the future of digital comics. Imagine what you could do with a playable graphic novel. Adopt any art style, implement any sort of gameplay. Hell, make a comic book space opera RPG if you want. Write a one-shot with unprecedented branching that you can just play over and over and over again, and it's a completely different comic book every single time. Or work with many artists, do an anthology of distinct comics and styles. I think the best thing about this is that the new format can bring together comic book creators and game developers and just let them focus on the things that they do best. Liberated for us is the first step. It's a proof of concept, an experiment. We adore comic books and we really want them to thrive. So try Liberated. Find us on Twitter, message us on Facebook, join us on Discord. I think that together, all of us, we can talk and explore and build the future of comic books right now.